All right, good morning and welcome to the first in a three-part series on the condition of the state of Iowa's electric generation. This webinar series is based on a publication IEC put out in October of 2020 that is available on the publications page of our website. However, today's presentation will include a preview of data that has been updated for 2020 to reflect really an interesting and banner year in terms of the state of our electric generation. Our research takes a look at the overall picture of electricity generation in Iowa, where we've been, where we are now, and what that means for where we might be heading in the future. Today's presentation will focus on Iowa's excess coal generation and what is that concept, what does it mean, and how we see that concept. So just a few notes on the structure of today's webinar. Steve, if you could go back one slide. Thank you. So the format for today, you don't need to worry about muting yourself. You are automatically muted and off camera by default. Please utilize the Q&A tool down at the bottom for any questions, and we will have a pretty good amount of time at the end to address the questions. We will either address them using the Q&A tool or live during the Q&A time. And then if you're having any technical issues at all, please feel free to use the chat tool to communicate that to us. Our presenters today, I am Carrie Johansson. I'm the Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council. I'll be helping moderate and run the show at the end here, but our main presenter today is Steve Geyer. He is the Energy and Climate Policy Specialist with IEC. Steve's been with us for about 1.5 years and brings a really rich history of experience. Since 2008, he has owned and led GWA International, a solar installation company based in Altoona that has designed and installed solar systems across the state. Prior to operating his own company, Steve held several key environmental positions with Iowa utilities, analyzing environmental laws and impacts, providing counsel on environmental compliance, conducting due diligence, and other critical environmental duties. Steve is originally from Northeast Iowa. He has a JD from the University of Iowa, a BA in physics from the University of Northern Iowa, and an AA in electronics engineering from Hawkeye Institute of Technology in Waterloo. And with that, I will kick it over to Steve here in a moment, but just a quick bit of info about the Iowa Environmental Council. We are a nonprofit, non-governmental organization focused on 2 key areas of work, clean water and clean energy. On the energy side, our goal is to reach 100% clean energy for the state of Iowa to appropriately tackle the climate crisis. We stand currently at 91 member organizations and businesses and have a staff of 15 exceptional professionals who help us do our work every day. With that, Steve, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Carrie. So let's get started. So we're going to roll into what we're going to cover today. And so we're going to look at Iowa generation. We're going to look at not only wind generation in Iowa, sort of where it's been, where it is now. We're going to look at the 20 years of change that has occurred within the generation mix within Iowa. We're going to look at the cost of generation and why we're seeing all these changes occur within Iowa. We're going to look at the growth that we've seen in wind. We're going to look at the aspects that solar is rapidly something that is going to increase in Iowa from where it is today. Then we're going to start taking a look at the coal generation that still remains in Iowa. We're going to look at the concept of basically when a utility basically sells the energy. Is that a customer or is that a marketplace sale? Then we're going to look at, again, as Carrie mentioned, the notion of an excess coal calculation, or what excess coal actually represents. And then we'll basically end that today on the first in this series with what plants could be retired that weren't really necessary to meet that demand. So let's start with looking at the wind generation in Iowa. And this is significant. You'll notice that in 2001, there really was not that much wind. But by 2020, we are now representing 60% of the overall generation in Iowa was wind in 2020. The crossover point, you may notice there, occurred in 2019, where wind generation surpassed coal generation in the state for the first time. And so as we look at that, there's some significance here in terms of not only what we've seen over the 20 years, but even in the past year. So in the past year, when we saw that crossover point, at that point, it was 41% of the generation in Iowa. And so in 1 year, it basically has moved from 41% to 60%. And we should note that the generation total in terms of wind, 11,660 was at the end of 2020, but that also continues to grow and is actually supposed to be past 12,000 megawatts fairly quickly. So let's look at this in terms of three primary sources of generation. And again, sort of this 20 years of change that we've seen, where the domination in 2000 was clearly from coal. And you can see that on the graph. I mean, it far outpaced any other form of generation. But now as we move to 2020, and over time, you'll see that, for instance, the coal generation continues to decline. The wind generation continues to increase and significantly over the past, I'll just say 5 years. But also pay attention to the methane gas production that also has increased since 2014, roughly. So we're going to ask the question in terms of why are we seeing these changes? And Iowa's not too much different in terms of what we're seeing in terms of change. And let's just look at the last 50 years. So Iowa and national, either one, coal clearly was the cheapest source 50 years ago. We saw a trend where natural gas became the cheaper source. There was a huge expansion of natural gas in the early portions of 2000s, but the issue with natural gas is price volatility on natural gas itself. And so we've seen sort of an up and down in natural gas. We've also seen a shift more recently with some more natural gas coming online, but that's certainly something that is not going to compete, I'll just say, long with wind or solar. And in fact, as we ask the question, then why is this occurring? So let's look at the cost of generation. And we'll note in this chart that we have the conventional sources at the bottom, and we have the renewable energy sources on the top. So this is recent information from Lazard's levelized cost. And I want to pay significant attention to this particular one because this is the unsubsidized analysis. In other words, many times you'll hear the comment that, well, if it wasn't for the subsidies, wind would not exist. But that's really not the case. If we look at basically wind, or if we even look at utility scale solar, they are competitive, and in fact, the wind right now is actually cheaper than the conventional sources, even the existing conventional sources within Iowa and around most of the country. So let's take a look and let's ask the question again, sort of this Iowa generation mix, and this represents the generation, not the capacity, but the generation that's occurred within the state. So we start back 2008. At that time, roughly 3/4 of our generation was coming from coal, 8% was coming from wind, nuclear 10% at this point in time, and then pay attention to the natural gas or the methane gas. The other, by the way, represents smaller sources. It may represent some hydro, which we have a little of. It may represent some petroleum or oil. It also represents others, whether it's biomass or biogas, et cetera. So now let's move forward to 2020. And it's striking in this really not much more than a decade of change that we've seen. So again, as we mentioned before, wind basically in 2020 represented 60% of this generation. Coal had declined from 3/4 of our generation to 22%. But no methane gas. That also, that's pretty close to a threefold increase in that same amount of time. Nuclear has decreased. Why? Because the nuclear plants are fixed. We haven't increased more in terms of number of plants. We've just shifted in terms of where our generation is coming from. And again, same thing with the 2%. Those resources really haven't changed much in terms of the plants they represent. And so it becomes less of the amount of our generation. But now let's talk about solar. So solar clearly is expanding. To date, we really have only seen solar for the most part as a distributed resource where our homes, our farms, our businesses have used solar to reduce their energy expenditures. But in 2020, net metering legislation was passed in Iowa that is very advantageous for individuals to put solar in. It will allow for net metering, which is, again, the notion that all of the energy is valued the same. And even though it basically previously had net metering in place, it was not statutory in concept. We think this is actually going to increase in the transition, basically, where we're going to see more solar occur. But we're seeing utility scale solar rapidly come to bear. So the Utilities Board approved 849 megawatts of utility scale solar in 2019. And we're seeing lots of announcements in terms of other solar coming on basically as announced. So MidAmerican has 100 megawatt solar in Webster County that they've announced. We've also got Lynn County with 2 projects combining almost for 800 megawatts. And Alliant has also announced an installation of 400 megawatts by 2023. This is also, we will just say, looked at in terms of the MISO aspect too. So MISO, the Midwest Independent System Operator, are responsible for, in essence, controlling, running our grid, ensuring that the grid operates properly. And so when we look at that, MISO has to approve everything that comes online that will be as on a part of our grid. And so currently there's 2,890 megawatts being studied of solar for connection to the grid. Again, we're really seeing a lot of solar being proposed, but I want to talk just a little bit about the grid itself, just to, I'll just say, dispel some of the things we hear, some of the things we've seen. So one of the notions that we've seen evident is individuals have this notion that if they have a power plant in their backyard, that somehow that's where their power is coming from. That's really not the case. So the grid acts as a tremendous resource to distribute that energy anywhere within the grid. So just as those wind farms are currently putting energy onto the grid, it doesn't matter where you live in Iowa. You are taking advantage of that energy from the wind farms or any other resource. And so it really is not the notion of a power plant in your backyard providing the power that you're actually using. And in fact, we're also seeing the shift to where, although I'll just say in the past 50 years, generation was viewed more centrally. And so we would have these large central plants, and then we used the grid basically to move the energy from the central plants out through the distribution system. That really is changing. As we've noticed with the wind and with the solar, all of these resources are being distributed on a broader area across the state. And this has some significance as we, I'll just say, move forward in this discussion. So we're going to take a deeper look then at the resources that Alliant and MidAmerican have that are either fueled from coal and or methane gas. So when we take a look at the Alliant plants, first notice that there's been a significant decrease in the overall amount of coal generation in this time frame. And so we're looking not that far back, 2017 through 2020, and at almost every single coal plant, and just so you know which are coal and which basically are the methane. So everything on, starting from the left-hand side, so Prairie Creek, Burlington, Lansing, Ottumwa, the Neal plants, Louisa, are all coal resources, although some of them are being shifted. Burlington is shifting to natural gas. Lansing is actually scheduled now to retire. Similarly, Prairie Creek, for the most part, is natural gas with just a little bit of coal remaining. The methane gas plants, we have Emory and Marshalltown. And you'll also notice here, when I was talking about the significant increase we're seeing in natural gas production, this is what we're seeing here. We're shifting from coal, at least for Alliant, to more natural gas production from these plants. I want to also give a perspective in terms of the size of these units. So when we talk about the wind generation, a common size for each of those wind turbines that you see is today right around 2 megawatts in terms of that already existing in the state. Clearly, we see turbines coming in that are bigger. Each of these repowering exercises that we're going through to repower existing turbines means we're trying to get more out of each of these turbines. But when we look at these central, what used to be utilized plants, these are clearly much bigger in terms of one location. So Emory, for instance, represents 535 megawatts, a combined cycle, meaning that it doesn't just burn the gas and then expel the heat, but it captures that heat to produce more energy. Marshalltown, a simple cycle and a combined cycle, but that's 820 megawatts. So these are large plants. Let's compare that to Ottumwa. So Ottumwa is roughly 725 megawatts. So the capacity is there at certainly the methane plants, but we'll also see that the size of these plants, with Ottumwa being the remainder there for Alliant, being a large plant. And by the way, many of these are joint-owned plants. So Ottumwa, Neal, and Louisa are all joint-owned plants. So MidAmerican and Alliant and some other entities own portions of these plants. Also want to pay attention to Ottumwa itself in terms of, how much could it generate and how much did it generate? So in 2020, the plant could have produced a lot more. But again, as we looked at the cost of generation, it explains that wind generation now is a much cheaper resource to utilize. So I approximate the capacity factor was somewhere in the 40% range for Ottumwa. So capacity factor, if you don't know, all that really means is, I'll simplify it to look at, suppose you just had a 1 megawatt plant. It would have the capacity to generate, if it had 100% capacity factor, you'd take 8,760 hours times the 1 megawatt, or you'd have 8,760 megawatt hours for the year. So that's 100% capacity factor. So when we look at the Ottumwa station at 725 times the 8,760, they generated at about 40% in 2020. Let's shift over to MidAmerican and sort of take a similar type view and analysis of what their plants actually did. So as we look at MidAmerican, that currently has about 625 megawatts of generating capacity. That's both owned and contracted. From a capacity perspective, that's about 60% of their capacity is wind, 23% coal, 12% methane gas, and 5% nuclear and other. What I find is interesting is that those capacity values are almost identical to the generation values for the state as a whole, even though, again, one's capacity, the potential, and one is actual production. So if we take a look at the plants themselves, so the only methane gas plant on here is Greater Des Moines. All the other plants on here are coal-fired, and in fact, they're all jointly owned units. But even here, we'll see that the production in 2020 in particular has declined significantly from all of these units. If we take a look at, and remember I basically referenced the notion of the capacity factor for Ottumwa and Alliant. So if we look at some of these others, I mean, we're seeing that the plants are really changing the way that they're operating, reflecting the fact, again, that wind is the cheaper resource, and that's what's being distributed more to the customers. And so if we took a look at Louisa, that capacity factor is approximately 26% in 2020, and Walter Scott 4, a very big unit. I mean, that's 922 megawatts, a lot of potential energy, but it was basically about 28% on its capacity factor. In fact, all of these units on this page are big units. Neil's, the 3 and the 4, 584, 696. Walter Scott 3, 726, and Louisa 812. The smallest unit is actually the Greater Des Moines, which again is a combined cycle methane gas plant. But its capacity factor, you'll note there wasn't much generation from that. In fact, it was about 16%. In other words, of the potential that could be at Greater Des Moines, it only operated at 16% of what it could have done, or its potential. So I'm going to move into the aspect of 100% renewable. And I'm sure you've seen the MidAmerican pledge that basically they're going to provide 100% renewable. But I want you to pay close attention to the words working with our customers, because what we're really talking about here is the customer. And I think what most of us don't recognize is that a customer is a defined term, and it doesn't really represent what I'll call the whole picture. In fact, let's talk about what is a customer. Well, a customer is really just an individual or an entity, a business entity. So you have a utility meter in Iowa, you receive electricity from the utility, and you pay for that, obviously. And that sum total then of all your metered customers becomes the utility retail load. And that retail load is really then what is referred to as the customers, plural. Whereas the utilities aren't just selling to the customers, they also sell to other utilities and classify that as a sale for resale. In other words, they generate the electricity in the state, but they sell it to somebody else, most likely out of state, again, over the MISO grid and the MISO marketplace. So how much of that is actually occurring in Iowa? Well, what we're going to find out is quite a bit. In fact, this has really always been the case, well, at least in recent times, has been the case where this tracks from 2016 through 2020. The green bars represent customer load. Again, these metered individuals that basically establish the retail load within the state. You'll notice that MidAmerican has been increasing over this time frame. Alliant, fairly stable, and 2020 certainly somewhat of an anomaly. Whether or not we actually saw an increase or a decrease, you'll note that it was two different stories, whether we looked at MidAmerican or Alliant. But that doesn't mean we didn't sell power to other utilities out of state. In fact, MidAmerican in 2020, 29% of the energy generated in basically the state was sold to utilities for 124.3 million. Even Alliant was basically 20% of all that energy they generated went to other utilities for 103.6 million. So let's look at this a slightly different way. So let's look at sort of a resource breakout for the two companies as far as how they derive the energy that was sold. And so we'll start with coal, and we'll note that certainly on the MidAmerican side, you'll see that far more came from the wind than came from the coal. I mean, 20 million versus 7 million, so a stark difference. Again, the nuclear, fairly constant, doesn't usually change that much, and that's based mainly on the operational characteristics of a nuclear plant. The other, again, represents smaller sources, really is not that significant, and the methane gas, then basically, again, not nearly as much as either the wind or the coal. When we look at Alliant, the thing I guess I would pay attention to and note is that the wind and the coal, at least in 2020, were about the same. Now, in the case of other, the other actually represents, in Alliant's case, a lot of energy is purchased, and when you purchase that energy, it's not necessarily something that's defined as to what was the resource that provided it, and so it's just categorized as other. Also, we'll note that, in fact, as we saw on the bar charts earlier, methane gas actually was a significant, and in fact, their largest identified source of energy in 2020. And then I want to talk about the aspect of, just because it's an opportune time to talk about this concept of baseload. And so I want to set the frame around this in terms of what does that term really even mean. Because I think there's confusion when people think about baseload as to whether we're talking about a plant or whether we're talking about what it really represents. What it really represents is nothing more than saying that a utility has a minimum amount of load at all times of the year that they have to satisfy and they have to meet. What it doesn't mean is that it necessarily identifies with a specific plant. And so this whole notion of baseload plant, which is, I think, a lot of times viewed, again, the two terms synonymous as being unlinkable, is where I want to sort of start thinking about this differently. Because all that really means is we have to be able to meet those requirements at all times of the day, 24/7. It doesn't necessarily default to a particular plant or a particular resource. And in fact, that's part of what the MISO market serves too, is the ability to satisfy those requirements where maybe you don't have the plant that is economical to operate at the time, and it may be far more economical to actually buy, for instance, the wind generation that's sitting out on the MISO market, and basically provide that to the customers instead of your own resource. So I'm going to shift in now to start to explain what the concept we've come up with that we're categorizing again as excess coal generation. So let's go back again to this notion of the customer load as opposed to everything else that the utility might be generating for purposes of selling to other utilities. So the customer load, the retail load, respectively, for each company is where we start. And so that's the amount of energy that we had to come up with, that the utilities had to come up with to basically provide the energy to their customers. Now we're going to start subtracting from that the energy that was generated from each of the resources, but we're going to do it in the order that we view as most environmentally beneficial to least beneficial, and sort of see where we end up in terms of how much of the coal did we actually need then to satisfy the needs of the customers. For both entities, you'll see that wind, certainly for MidAmerican, wind is providing a significant portion of that overall need. And in fact, that clearly is, at least right now, our most environmentally friendly resource. As solar starts to increase, that will also be a very friendly environmentally resource to add to the overall generation mix. We're going to basically subtract on MidAmerican side the nuclear, although nuclear has certainly long-term waste issues. It also, at least during its production cycle, is fairly environmentally friendly. And so we're going to subtract that next. You'll notice on the Alliant side, we jump then to the other resources. There used to be, and by the way, that other resources, again, if you remember, I said that represents also purchases. So when Alliant then sold the Duane Arnold nuclear facility, that no longer started showing up as their actual nuclear production, because NextEra Resources that purchased the plant then sold the energy back to Alliant. And so that then started showing up in the other resources, but also recognize, if you hadn't seen Duane Arnold's nuclear plant, last fall has officially closed. Then we're going to start subtracting, as we did on both sides, again, the other resources. We don't necessarily know all the time what those might be, but just given the overall, again, nature of the grid and the fact that wind is so much cheaper than any other resource on that list, we're going to subtract that, making the presumption that it probably was, in fact, wind resource for the most part that was in that number. Then we're going to subtract the methane gas plants. Certainly, we can say that they're far better than coal as far as the benefits they have to provide energy, not with as much, I'll just say, pollution. I mean, the greenhouse gas equivalent, they're basically 1/2 of the greenhouse gas that coal is. Even the other criteria pollutants that we see with methane gas, not nearly as many of the pollutants as the coal plants, including obviously sulfur dioxide. And even though the coal plants in Iowa have all the controls that are needed to control all of these pollutants, that doesn't mean that we don't emit a tremendous amount of both air pollutants and, importantly, also something that I think is overlooked because people don't really see them. The coal plants generate what's called fly ash. And so fly ash it's the ash residue, in essence, from the burning of the coal, but it contains a lot of chemicals in it. Those chemicals, some of them will volatilize during the burning of the coal, but a lot of them end up being deposited in the ash, and then that ash is landfilled. And unlike, I'll just say, your standard municipal waste landfill, these are landfills. They're called mono landfills, meaning only one waste stream goes into them. And even though they are inert, meaning that they're not going to have the issues of a municipal facility that has to worry about decay and methane production then from that landfill, it does have to worry about the groundwater. And those elements that are in the fly ash can and have actually entered into some of the Iowa waterways and groundwater. And we'll talk about that in a future actually webinar. But now we're going to come down to the key number there in terms of the numbers for 2020 as far as the customer load that was not served by any of the resources that were listed above. And you'll see for both companies, it's zero. And so, in fact, what that really meant then is all of the coal generation could be viewed as excess and could have been provided in some other fashion, some other manner than actually providing it from the coal plants. So what did that really mean? So again, sort of a refresher in terms of the coal plants that we have in Iowa. What it really meant was that for 2020, all of the MidAmerican and Alliant coal generation was excess. So Walter Scott 3 and 4, Neal 3 and 4, Louisa, Ottumwa, Prairie Creek 4, and Lansing was really not required for Iowa customers. It may have been used for other purposes, but it certainly wasn't necessarily needed for Iowa customers. Also, we'll note that Lansing 4 has, again, announced that they, in fact, are retiring that plant. So it really becomes quickly off the list. And Prairie Creek 4, frankly, is a very small unit. Nothing, I'll just say size-wise, compared to the Walter Scotts, the Neals, the Louisa, or the Ottumwa. So with that, I want to basically certainly invite you to the next in the series of these webinars. The next, which is being titled The Impacts from the Excess Coal Generation. So we're taking a look at then, when I mentioned the waste products, whether that happens to be emissions or whether it happens to be the solids. And we're going to take a look at what does that really mean in terms of what does that do, aspects of whether it's our health, et cetera, whether it is basically groundwater pollution. That will occur on August 18th, which is also a Wednesday, and also will be at 11:30. So same time as this one, just August 18th. The third in the series, which I find the most compelling, will be on October 13th, also Wednesday at 11:30. And it's going to take a look at, now that we've identified all of these wastes, now that we've identified how it impacts Iowans, what does that really mean in terms of sort of the cost to Iowans? And more importantly, if we really took a look at this and accounted for externalities, and we looked at what is the cost of generation then from these coal facilities compared to the wind generation that we have. So I look forward to it. And with that, I will turn it over to questions.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Hopefully you're all taking a moment to absorb what I know is a lot of information. There was a great deal of work done on this analysis, so thank you, Steve, for laying this out for us. We have a few questions that have come in during your presentation. So between the two of us, hopefully we can respond to some of these. Our first question was about MISO. There was a question about whether regional transmission organizations like MISO are honest brokers of all stakeholder interests. My perspective on that is that the RTOs can be really difficult places for sort of average folks to engage. I know that in some RTOs, they're working on trying to improve that access, but they are certainly dominated by the folks who are members of those organizations. There are ways that state regulatory bodies try to work together to engage and get their interests considered as well. But I think it would be safe to say they're pretty notoriously difficult places for sort of average folks to engage. I don't know, Steve, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I would agree. Certainly from the aspect of, I don't think your average individual can effectively participate. You have to be someone who is not only constantly following and working with these type of issues, but the other aspect, and whether it's MISO or the other RTOs, that does, I'll just say, and in fact, it displays itself when we look at things like the ability of, to put transmission in. It's extremely cumbersome, and there's so many studies that go on. And so with an average turnaround time from the time that a transmission project basically is proposed to actually construction, when that's 10 years, as we already have learned, the latest round of transmission projects for MISO that was approved, we're already at full capacity on those additions. And we really haven't come up yet, they're in the process of doing it, but we haven't come up with the ability to, whether we have to look out further or whether we have to change the process. But yeah, I mean, not only the aspect of, are they fair and independent, which that one I'm not going to weigh in on, especially since they're primarily member organizations. But certainly it's something that, as I look at it, we have to try and look at how do we address this to try and move forward with transmission in a more timely manner.
Yeah, and a related question, and I do not know the answer to this. So Steve, I'm going to see if you know, and we haven't been engaged in deeply in the MISO directive process for a little while, but the question is whether unused coal generation capacity is included in the calculations that transmission companies use to justify large interstate transmission projects.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And actually, I think they have to be, because this is my take on it, because when those plants basically have to accredit themselves every year, whether you run the plant or not, you basically have to accredit that capacity. And so MISO basically requires you to have a certain amount of accredited capacity to meet your load demands plus a margin. And so, yes, I believe that obviously the transmission capacity is there that reflects the ability, the potential. And so, yeah, I don't understand where the question is going, and that's that debate has occurred elsewhere in this country in terms of whether we really need more capacity, or is it just the way we utilize the capacity?
Okay, great. So we have a couple of questions related to sort of, I guess I would factor them into the kind of reliability focus. One is asking about, the extreme weather swings in Texas and problems in ERCOT, both this winter and now this summer as well. And just the availability of on kind of an hourly basis of generation, sort of would the utilities argue that they need to maintain this for purposes of serving, other entities for reliability? And then, yeah, so for that, I mean, what do you make of that argument?
There's a lot embedded within that, because so let's start with the reliability aspect and the notion that that asset absolutely is necessary. I'm going to say, given the amount of generation we have within the state, that clearly I think the answer is no. We don't need all of it for sure, even under a reliability scenario. And if I take a look at, for instance, MidAmerican has noted that 83% of their customer load was provided by wind. And you'll also see it in the charts that we provided, where clearly they're changing the operational mode of all of their facilities. And so as they provide more and more wind, they are providing less and less coal. But yeah, we're not seeing the change in reliability. We're still seeing the ability to basically provide power at 24/7. But I think what we're trying to establish is that it doesn't mean all of it's necessary. Clearly, we could cut down on what it is that we have today. The other notion I want to touch on, because a lot of people have this confusion that came out of Texas. And yes, they suffered some consequences of combination, poor planning, cost-driven decisions, where, for instance, in Texas, they're not like Iowa in terms of how you get your power. They have customers in Texas can buy their power from any entity. It's an open market. So the entities that provide that power don't have incentives, frankly, to ensure reliability. Their incentive is to sell power. And if they don't sell it, they don't sell it. If they do, they do. And so that resulted in problem one. Problem two, the aspects of what resources worked and what didn't in terms of their cold snap. And probably we might see with this heat wave too. It's more of an issue of, again, preventative measures. So if we took measures in Iowa to ensure that our wind turbines can operate in cold weather, which we have, and they do. If we take efforts in Iowa to, for instance, enclose our plants, because we know we have weather extremes and they operate effectively. In Texas, that's not necessarily the case. And then the biggest factor that people, and again, I point back to methane gas, people overlook is just because you have that methane gas plant doesn't mean it's going to run if you can't get the methane gas. And that is exactly what caused some of these spikes out of Texas, is all these gas wells shut down. What most people don't recognize is that the reason they shut down is that in the same span of time that I'm talking about, where we saw these shifts in fuel sources, where natural gas, so a natural gas compressor station, almost all of them used to siphon off part of the natural gas that they were transporting to actually power the compressor station. But then in Texas, they found that it was much cheaper to actually convert those compressors over to electricity. Well, that's fine, unless suddenly you don't have electricity, and that's exactly what happened. There was some miscommunication within Texas where they didn't identify these compressor stations as being emergency. And so the utilities then cut off the power to the compressor stations. And without that, which further complicate, because it didn't matter if the wellhead was basically frozen or not, which some of them did. if you didn't have the compressor station, you weren't going to move the gas. And so Texas is a scenario where I know people like to point to it, but to me, the overall lesson should be, which is underway right now in some extent, create a grid where everybody's connected, because Texas is all on their own right now, and that's what ERCOT is. That is their reliability system, and they don't interconnect for the most part with MISO or Southwest Power Pool. If they had, they probably wouldn't have seen the issue they had.
Yeah, transmission, definitely a big one on all of those. And I think that, I'm getting several questions here. One was related to whether we were able to do an hour by hour analysis, and that's frankly just not information that's publicly available. And so the data that we used was publicly available data. And when we think about, so there are a number of other factors that go into this. Someone else asked about replacement costs, basically. That is absolutely the kind of analysis that should be done. So we look at, in this case, we looked at, is this generation needed to meet needs in Iowa? No, it's not. It's excess generation. So from there, which plants are the ones that are the least economic? I think we know that answer from analysis and testimony that we submitted in some recent dockets that show the Neal units up near Sergeant Bluff, Sioux City are some of the most money-losing plants on the system, and could be replaced with renewables and save money for customers. That's a trend that's happening nationwide. You're seeing this cost flip happen where the cost of running coal plants is actually in excess of the cost of completely replacing them with renewables. So we know, and we're increasingly getting a better idea of what that looks like in Iowa to address that question. And then I want to flip it over to Steve for some really great questions about what are the sort of other things we need to complete the full picture of 100% renewable. So we know we have awesome wind and solar potential in Iowa. It's grown a lot, but what are the other features of getting to a 100% renewable system?
Sure. So yeah, I'll start with the one that obviously everyone knows about, but so batteries. Batteries are going to play a key role in our future move to renewables. Will it necessarily be the only thing? Of course not. But I believe it's 415 megawatts of battery resources currently in the MISO queue for Iowa, meaning it's in the planning process where we'll add that. We have a few examples. Alliant has some examples. MidAmerican has some examples, but these are relatively small, comparatively speaking, battery resources. I think other things we're going to see, which we haven't seen a lot of yet, but and it might just be transitional in nature, but I think we're going to see actually hydrogen play a role in our transition, partially because we can take some of the renewable generation that we have today that may currently be curtailed. In other words, the utility has to basically clamp the wind turbine down because they have no place for the energy to go, therefore it's curtailment. Use that same excess to produce hydrogen through electrolysis. That hydrogen has multiple pathways that come back to renewable. Certainly, hydrogen could be fed through a fuel cell. This works well in terms of distributed architecture to produce electricity with really no emissions. It also has a transitional nature to it. So these same methane plants that we talk about that are on the system right now, GE, Siemens, GE, I think they all basically have the same goal. And in fact, have all demonstrated that they can use hydrogen today as to offset some of the methane, and I think it's up to 20 to some of them are even 30% now. They could actually inject hydrogen into existing plants. But all the companies have the same goal. They also all believe they can achieve 100% hydrogen through a combustion turbine. So I think that's one pathway, and it represents a renewable aspect since you're producing it from renewable to begin with, and it doesn't have the aspects of emitting then your climate forcing gases.
Yeah, and a couple other things I would add is just, yes, definitely, per the last answer as well, transmission is one big part of the solution. Energy efficiency, which many on the call on the webinar are probably aware, has really taken a dive in Iowa following some legislation in 2018. If we're going to see increased demand for electricity related to vehicle and building electrification, using less energy, using energy every kilowatt hour as efficiently as possible is really critical to getting back to a place of sustainable growth in our energy demand to begin with.
Yeah,
go ahead, Steve.
Let me tap back on transmission, because even though I noted that during the presentation, I'm not sure that the full import was garnered out of my comment. Again, we don't have to necessarily even have a wind turbine blowing in the state of Iowa if we have transmission capacity, because the reality is, even though the wind might not be blowing in Iowa, well, chances are pretty good it might be blowing in North Dakota or South Dakota or Nebraska. It might be blowing east of us. And so, or even the solar production, same thing. All of these resources can work together in a transmission network and alleviate this aspect and almost, I'll just say, a paranoia we have in terms of the ability to do what happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine.
Yep. Thank you for going into that a little bit more. I want to just quick answer a question about methane versus natural gas. These are terms that we use interchangeably. If you hear us say natural gas, methane gas, fossil gas, those are all the same thing. And let's see, I think one additional question, maybe a couple more we can take here. Can we expand upon the benefit of microgrids based on the Texas situation? Microgrid thoughts?
Yeah, certainly. My thought is, I mean, I know this has been discussed after the degrade show. Certainly, microgrids could play a key role in terms of reliability. It would do it as so you might have the larger grid as the overlay, but then you have microgrids contained within that. So let's just take Cedar Rapids as an example. If they had potentially, microgrids in place, and it's not going to be for everything and for everyone, but there may have been entities that had the ability that they could have provided an area, that same resource. I guess overall, I believe it helps us to, again, distribute our resources. It makes us more resilient no matter how we look at it. The further we move away from this notion of centralized anything, I think we build resiliency.
Steve, if anyone is familiar with this, I think it might be you. I have not heard about this, but the question is whether we're familiar with a proposal to retrofit fuel pipelines to underground HVDC transmission lines or links.
I have not heard that one. Obviously, I think most of us are aware of the Sioux line, basically in Northeast Iowa, that follows railroad right-of-ways. That's an interesting concept. No, I have not heard that one, although I have heard lots of other projections in terms of how to utilize those assets. So.
Great. Okay, well, we really appreciate all of the great questions, and thank you all so much for attending today. Steve mentioned that this is the first in a 3-part series where we will be covering on August 18th is our next webinar. And then following the final one will be on October 13th. We will be releasing a new version of this publication. We're targeting August for that with all of the updated data. And so we hope that you all take the time to take a look at that. Yeah, once again, thanks everyone for attending today. And we will be in touch following up with this with a link to the recording of the video from today, as well as information about the upcoming webinars. Thanks all.